I'd like to welcome you to the Climate Adaptation Research Seminar Series. The Climate Adaptation Research Center is a UC Davis organization that supports intersectional research across many departments on campus. This year, we have hosted a series of seminars around various adaptation topics, from the recent IPCC 6 assessment report to drought, sea level rise, and wildfires. My name is Sandra Hall, and I am the moderator for today. So I'd like to thank you all for joining us and welcome you to our seminar on climate change and human infectious diseases. Now for some brief virtual reminders, all attendees are in listen-only mode. If you have any problems during the webinar, please use the chat function to message me and I'll do my best to help you out. If you have a question, you can type it into the Q&A box and we will ask it of Dr. Hauser during the Q&A session. This webinar is being recorded for you to watch later and share with colleagues. At the moment, if you can share your name and affiliation in the chat with all panelists and attendees, we would love to know who is in our audience today. Now, I am pleased to introduce our speaker for the day, Dr. Naomi Hauser. Dr. Hauser is an infectious disease physician offering care for adults with general infectious disease and HIV, and is specifically experienced with young adults with HIV as they transition from pediatrics to adult HIV care. Dr. Hauser received her doctorate at St. George's University School of Medicine in the West Indies. Her research interests include public health, One Health, zoonotic infectious diseases, and human infectious disease as it relates to climate change. And of course, she believes in providing evidence-based, compassionate, and personalized care in a comfortable, open-minded setting. Welcome, Naomi.
Hi, thank you, Sandra. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming. Let me just get started. So I know a lot of you are from different schools and departments across the university. So I'm trying to kind of give this talk so that everybody kind of can be on the same page about a little bit of it. If you have any questions, just let me know or bring it up in the chat, or you can ask, I guess, at the end, right, Sandra? Because everybody will be muted.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So this talk is on climate change and infectious diseases in North America. I actually came to UC Davis a year ago to work on climate change and infectious diseases. And this is it's a good place to do that. And it seemed like my division was pretty open to it. There are not a lot of other physicians who are into this field for some reason. I don't understand why, but I'm working on it. So let me see. So I have no disclosures, just adding this slide. And I don't know if there are any physicians here who are at the hospital, but I did almost the same exact talk at Grand Rounds last week. So if you're listening to this for the second time, I'm sorry, or thank you. Okay, so the objectives for my talk are changes. Yeah.
Sorry, we can't see your screen yet.
Oh no, sorry. Hold on. Oh my gosh. How do I get out of here? Hold on a sec. I forgot that I stopped sharing. Okay, which one do you guys see now?
We see the presenter's view, so your notes.
All right. Okay.
There we go.
Now you see my slides, right? Okay, let me just. All right. Okay, so what are we on? Disclosures, right? Okay. I have too many screens around here. So the objectives, what I'm hoping that you guys will get out of this talk are to recall the relationships between climate change, climate-induced extreme weather events and infectious diseases, and then list several modes of infectious disease transmission. And then what I like to do is examine the healthcare industry's role in contributing to and treating climate change related infectious diseases. So for a long time, we thought of climate change as a future threat to human health, but we can already see direct and indirect impacts of climate change on health now. So despite the inherent threats that the climate crisis poses, it hasn't been until relatively recently that explicit attention has been paid to the risks a changing climate has on human health. In 1990, when the first IPCC report was released, the word health was mentioned throughout, but it wasn't given the profound consideration that it's given now. Since that initial publication, subsequent assessments and reports have increasingly dedicated space to specific human health content areas. And this change is also reflected in the increasing number of publications dedicated to both climate change alone as well as to climate change and health. So in the top, let me put my laser pointer on. So over here, you can see like kind of the number of times health is mentioned in the IPCC reports, and you can see it's going up dramatically over the years. And then on the right, this is just, there was a paper published on just the number of times climate change and health could be found when searching the literature. And you can see that that's increasing kind of with the IPCC reports as they come out. So along with the increasing raw numbers of publications dedicated to climate change and human health, the field has expanded to include specific health content areas, including extreme weather events, infectious diseases, respiratory diseases, malnutrition, and some other effects. So infectious diseases was kind of the main area of interest for a long time until recently when extreme weather events have kind of taken over. There's also been dramatic increase in the number of publications examining the effects of climate change on mental health. So the importance of this new field is reflected in some neologisms such as solastalgia, which some of you may have heard of, meaning the feeling of being homesick when you're still at home, but the environment has changed, and eco-anxiety, meaning the chronic fear of the impact of climate change on one's future. Um, these effects are often investigated among young people, usually Generation Z, but also among farmers in kind of underdeveloped countries that are really being hit by climate change the hardest. So the climate crisis is finally starting to get the sort of emergency attention it deserves within the medical community. And aside from that call to action that you can read in almost every high impact journal you can find, medical journal that you can find, multiple health and environmental societies are recognizing the importance of climate change on human health. And I just listed a few here. Morbidity and mortality can be directly associated with extreme temperatures, droughts, fires, tropical and coastal storms. Weather and climate can also have indirect impacts on human health related to infrastructure failures. Because of this, the impacts of climate change will vary considerably across the country and the world because of climate factors on top of already existing health inequities related to race, gender, culture, and socioeconomics. The list of ways the changing environment can impact health is broad. And sorry, let me move this over here. Is broad and includes virtually every organ system and medical subspecialty. The mechanisms by which climate change impacts infectious diseases are diverse and often include multiple factors such as ecological, social, and biological factors. Infectious disease transmission is influenced by local temperatures, extreme weather events, exposure to animal and insect vectors, and unique interactions between people that result from weather-driven displacement, migration, and rising population densities. around limited natural resources. I'm going to skip the climate change primer slides that I had put together before, because I think you're probably more familiar with this than the doctors were at Grand Rounds. But if anybody wants me to go back to them at the end, I can do that. So changes in water temperature, salinity, currents, and seasonality patterns are all results of climate warming that can affect the abundance and incidence of waterborne infections that can cause a range of diseases associated with ingestion, inhalation, or direct inoculation of pathogens. And the waterborne disease that I want to focus on the most is Vibrio species. So climate models indicate that sea surface temperature increases will track pretty well with increases in the abundance, geographic distribution, and duration of risk of Vibrio species infections. Infections with pathogenic Vibrio species, including Vibrio cholera, which is the bacterium responsible for the diarrheal disease cholera, have been linked to climate change and extreme weather events. Vibrio cholerae is best known to cause profuse watery diarrhea, while there are other non-cholera Vibrio that I've listed. These aren't all of them, but these are kind of the top three. They're better known for sometimes watery diarrhea, but also often wound infections. And some of them, such as Vibrio vulnificus, can have a fatality rate of up to 50%. Vibrio infections are transmitted to people and animals via ingestion of contaminated water, which can cause diarrhea, or direct inoculation of wounds, causing wound infections. In the US, the non-cholera Vibrio species listed here, Parahemolyticus, vulnificus, and Alginolyticus, are responsible for the largest disease burden among Vibrio species. And altogether, Vibrio infections account for approximately 80,000 illnesses and can cost about $300 million annually in the United States. Vibrio cholerae is not common in the United States, and then these other Vibrio species, there's a couple different ways people get them. They're not common around the West Coast, except for like the northern West Coast. But the ways that people often get them are, you'll have people with, say they have wounds on their lower extremities, and then they like to go soak their legs in like some brackish water, like either in the ocean or some other kind of like brackish / salty water. And then they can get contamination of the wounds they already have present. Or another way that happens maybe more commonly is people will be like shucking oysters at home in the kitchen, or they'll be out clamming. I don't know what it is when it's oysters, like oystering or something, but they'll be out clamming and they collect these shellfish, and then they get a cut with the shell of the shellfish, and the cut is contaminated with the Vibrio species that's already on the shell. So that can happen in any part of the country. So if you find a patient with one of these Vibrio infections and they're not in an endemic region, that's how it happened. Most Vibrio species naturally occur in coastal and estuarine water where the environment's warm and brackish, with seasonal variations in prevalence and infection risk. The Gulf Coast, Mid-Atlantic, and Northeastern states, like Rhode Island, Connecticut, really New England, along with Washington and Hawaii, have the highest reported incidence of non-cholera Vibrio infection in the country. And then there was this analysis of CDC Vibrio surveillance data that found a 20-year increase in Vibriosis incidence nationwide for all three of those most common non-cholera Vibrio species from 1996 to 2010. And this trend has been associated with warming ocean temperatures. So you can see on all of these graphs. So this is perihemolyticus, vulnificus, and alginolyticus, and they've all been increasing with time and as water temperatures are increasing. Warming sea surface temperatures have also been associated with increased incidence of Vibrio vulnificus specifically in both Florida and Maryland. And studies have found longer Vibrio vulnificus and perihemolyticus detection period with prolonged water temperature warming, as well as broader salinity tolerance on both the high and low ends with higher temperatures. So this slide looks super clear on my screen, but I've gotten some feedback that it might not be clear on other people's screens. So if anyone can't see it, just make a comment in the chat and I'll try to explain what I'm looking at. But there, in a small study I did when I was at the University of Maryland, we looked at monthly invasive vibriosis rates from the Maryland Health Department from 2010 to 2018 and compared it to public water temperature data from the Baltimore Chesapeake Bay. So the top graph is unsurprising. And we found vibriosis rates in Maryland correlated with warmer temperatures, which you can see on the top. So this is, on the bottom is years. So this is 2010 to 2018 on the right. And then by season, the top is the water temperature. So you can see it's like warmer in the summer, cooler in the winter. And it correlates perfectly with the vibriosis rates in Maryland during the same time period. So they're high when the water is warm and low when the water is cold. So that's not surprising. What was surprising though is on the bottom graph. So this is just January to December, and then each line is a different year. And it's the same thing where you see like the high temperature in the summer months and high rate in the summer months. But what I found was like these kind of peaks in 2012 and 2016. And I was just kind of looking into what did these have in common? And what we found was that these were actually the warmest years on record. So 2012 was the warmest year in the Chesapeake Bay for surface water temperatures, and 2016 was the warmest year on global record. Okay, so this is another really interesting one. So the geographic distribution of cases of another infection called primary amoebic meningoencephalitis also seems to have expanded with increasing average annual temperatures. This is also called PAM, and it's a rare brain infection. There's only about 8 cases a year, and it's caused by this amoeba called Naegleria fowleri. It's primarily a pediatric illness, and it has a fatality rate of greater than 97%. So basically, if you're infected, and there's not really anything we can do about it. It's one of these infections where we don't have a treatment, so we kind of give one antibiotic from every possible class of antibiotics, just hoping like maybe they'll all work together and somehow do something, and they don't. The amoeba is found in soil and warm fresh water, and infections often associated with exposure to natural recreational water, such as lakes or ponds. But you may have heard of it because it's in the news, or it was in the news at least, when people were getting infections from their neti pots that they were using for their sinusitis. So historically, exposures in the US have occurred in the southeastern states, so like around this area. But recently, the geographic range seems to have been expanding northward. And there was a CDC review of PAM in the US from 1937 to 2013 that found that of the 142 cases across 18 states, the majority were identified in the southern half of the country, primarily Texas, Florida, and Virginia. And then, but cases are recently being diagnosed farther north. So now they're diagnosed as far north as Minnesota up here. And the northernmost cases over the 60-year time span all were identified in or after 2010. There was another review, a shorter time frame from 1978 to 2010. And that's the map we're looking at here, that confirmed the same findings of the previous study and found that 6 of the 7 northernmost cases all occurred in or after 2010. And these authors found an average northward shift of about 13.3 kilometers per year. I think I'm going to skip this one because it's not quite as interesting. So then there's several soil and plant dwelling pathogenic microbial species with human and food-related infectious disease impacts expected to increase in range and virulence in response to climate change as well. The one that I find the most interesting is Fusarium species. So this is a huge genus of fungus that kind of lives all over the place, and these fungi can infect plants and animals. Different species infect different plants and different animals, but we definitely see this infection in people. So there have been outbreaks of Fusarium crop infections that occurred largely with warmer weather conditions and are expected to increase with an overall warming climate. This species make up a large group of plant and animal pathogens and produce mycotoxins, which can contaminate food crops, leading to deadly human health consequences, including something called acute toxic, I think it's called acute mycotoxicosis. And then it can also have longer term effects, which seem to be various cancers. The effects have been seen in various outbreaks across the USSR over the 20th century, killing thousands of people at a time. And there are various Fusarium species that can cause infections in humans, and these are often skin and wound infections in immunocompromised or burned patients. So sometimes we'll have patients that are immunocompromised, and like before their immune system kind of comes back to at least like an adequate level, they'll be out gardening, and then they can get some infection with Fusarium, some skin infection with Fusarium from working in their garden. Other times we see this infection in burn patients. So if somebody had a burn and then rolled around, say they had like a really bad burn and then rolled around in the soil to try to put it out, we can see Fusarium contaminating their burns. This is another one that I think is really super interesting. So Cryptococcus gattii is another human pathogenic yeast with wood and soil as its environmental reservoirs. And it's found in various geographic locations, but the highest incidence is in Vancouver Island, Canada, where it was first identified in 1999. It's acquired by inhalation of spores, causing some degree of pulmonary infection in about half of exposed patients. From the lungs, the infection can disseminate most often to the central nervous system, where it can cause a potentially fatal meningitis. And there's an opportunistic infection called Cryptococcus neoformans, which opportunistic means the infection is really only going to happen in someone who has an immune system that can't fight it off, so someone who's immunocompromised. Cryptococcus gattii, on the other hand, can infect people with intact immune systems. So this fungus thrives in sunny areas of moderate temperature with above freezing winters, like Vancouver Island, where it's been found in tree samples, soil samples, and over a quarter of air samples. It's also been isolated from the same type of samples going further south along the west coast of North America, and then even as far east as Idaho. One really interesting thing about this fungus is that This one, like other fungi, can produce melanin in response to environmental stress. So, and melanization of Cryptococcus, the other one, neoformans, has been associated with increased temperature tolerance to both heat and cold. So as this pathogen undergoes environmental stress, we might be able to see it spread both north and south as its temperature tolerance broadens. I'm going to skip this one too. I want to move on to the wildfires and air quality. So as climate change leads to warming global average temperatures, longer fire seasons, and longer durations of drought, it increases the potential for larger and more severe wildfires, especially in regions like the Western United States, like in California. Fires can lead to both inhalation of microbes and infection of burns and other wounds because of the mobilization of pathogens in smoke. There was this 2020 special report in the New England Journal of Medicine that highlighted the human health effects of climate change and wildfires, which was great for paying attention to wildfires and human health, except the emphasis was on direct burn injury, smoke, particulate matter inhalation, and mental health effects. But missing from it was infectious disease complications of worsening wildfires. This is a new area of research that's being called pyroaerobiology, and it focuses on the living components of smoke, which at least in part are made up of infectious pathogens of potential human health concern. I borrowed this slide from one of the authors of the study, Dr. Kopsiar, who's a collaborator of mine. And in this study, researchers from the University of Idaho, where Dr. Kopsiar works, and the University of Florida analyzed microbial cells in smoke emitted from prescribed fires in North Florida and found that smoke contained 5-fold higher concentrations of microbial cells with increased bacterial and fungal species richness than the pre-ignition air. The type of fuel burned also influenced the concentration of diversity and mobilized aerosols. So you can see on this graph over here, ambient air really had the fewest DNA containing cells, and then the different kinds of fuel had different amounts of DNA containing cells. They further distinguished between viable and non-viable DNA containing cells and found that approximately 80% of the cells had viable DNA. And they did this by culture method. And they isolated about 70 microbial types, including some known pathogens to people and plants. So the question of wildfire smoke and infectious pathogens also comes up in the clinical setting. And there was a group from the University of California at San Francisco who kind of noticed that during the 2017 wildfire season, they thought they were seeing an increased number of invasive mold infections, such as aspergillosis and coccidioidomycosis. They collected data from 22 California hospitals over the 4 years and compared admissions for invasive mold infections with the occurrence of large wildfires within a 200-mile radius of the emitting hospital. Large fires characterized nearly half of the study months, and they were associated with increased risk of admission for invasive mold infections, but not for invasive candida infections, which is a yeast and served as their control. There were a lot of problems with this study. There were a lot of confounders that it didn't take into account, such as the effects of seasonal dust and windstorms, the relationship between candida colonization and invasive mold infections. But it's really maybe the only study we have so far looking at the relationship between wildfire occurrence and fungal infections. So we're trying to do something sort of similar here. Last fall during the wildfire season, we noticed an increase in our mold infections as well at the UC Davis Hospital. And then we mapped this out. So we looked back to 2017 because we could go back 3 years pretty easily in our electronic medical record and looked at the number of invasive mold infections in our burn patients. And we could see kind of some spikes over time, but the most interesting thing was here last fall, we had this huge increase in the number of molds that were cultured out of patients, which is shown in the bars. So it was the highest number in raw numbers, also in species identified, but then also in the line that you can see here, this is the number of patients who grew the different kinds of molds. So this was also the most patients we had in any given month over the last 3 years as well. There are a lot of things we didn't account for in this kind of just simple graphing of the raw data, such as age or comorbidities. We didn't look at burn size. We didn't look at mechanism of burn. So this isn't like wildfire patients only or anything like that. We didn't control for any of that stuff, but it was an interesting finding and kind of an interesting association with the biggest wildfire season we have on record. Another interesting thing about wildfires is there's possibly an association between wildfires and the skin microbiome of patients who are wildfire burn patients. So there's a study done out of Australia comparing bacterial culture data in wildfire burn patients to routine burn patients to assess differences in bacterial colonization. And among the 18 wildfire burn patients and 36 routine burn patients included in the study, wildfire burn patients had significantly more cultures resulting in bacterial growth overall, and more cultures growing a type of a gram-negative bacteria rather than gram-positive bacteria, which were found more commonly in the routine burn patients. So the findings suggest the possibility that environmental exposures can increase the risk of infection with certain environmental pathogens, while simultaneously contributing to the alteration of at least the human skin microbiome. These are important things for physicians, especially like infectious disease physicians who are going to consult on patients, because it might change our plan for antibiotic therapy if we don't know the pathogen and we have to pick something quickly. Anthropogenic climate change and extreme weather events have the potential to alter the habitats and geographic distribution of a large number of animals, which includes hosts and vectors of human diseases. And ticks are the most common. I get sent a lot of pictures of ticks from my friends and family and colleagues. And people love for me to identify them and tell them what infections they can get from the tick that they just found. And other people send me pictures of bugs that are not necessarily ticks. So the US is home to a lot of tick vectors with the potential to carry and spread a variety of infectious pathogens. Lyme disease is the most prevalent vector-borne disease in the United States. It's endemic to the Northeast and Midwest, and it's caused by the bacterium Borrelia burgdorferi. It's transmitted to humans primarily by the Ixodes scapularis tick in the US and Canada, with a much smaller contribution from Ixodes pacificus, which is the kind of Ixodes tick we have here in California. In California, I think it's something like about 5% of the Ixodes pacificus ticks carry the Borrelia burgdorferi pathogen. So the ticks acquire the bacterium after feeding on a reservoir host, which is usually the white-footed mouse. And then probably the second most common is the deer. Early stages of Lyme disease are when you can see this bullseye rash here that's very characteristic. Doesn't always have to look like that though. And then if it's left untreated, it can develop into more serious consequences, such as long-term arthritis, meningitis, and sometimes cardiac arrhythmias. And it looks like there's a changing geographic distribution of Ixodes ticks, apparently linked to climate warming in North America. While Lyme disease was first identified in the US in the 1970s, it wasn't identified in Canada until around 2004, and northward expansion of the Ixodes ticks continues to be ongoing. Empirical models of Ixodes distribution in Canada have found that not only would the geographic distribution of the tick vector expand with warming climate, but the rate of expansion also seems to be increasing as temperatures warm. The geographic distribution of the reservoir host, the primary reservoir host, the white-footed mouse, also seems to be expanding northward. And the expansion of both of these will most likely mean we see an expanded distribution of Lyme disease in North America. This is going to be important for doctors too, because a lot of doctors outside of endemic regions don't really know how to identify it. So we're going to have to kind of teach that. There are a lot of other ticks that can carry human pathogens. One of the main ones in the US is the Dermacenter species. So this genera is widely distributed across the United States and southern Canada and transmits multiple rickettsial organisms, including Rickettsia rickettsii, which you may know as the agent of Rocky Mountain spotted fever, or you may have heard of Rocky Mountain spotted fever, and it's a potentially fatal disease. A 2020 study out of the UC Davis Vet School aimed to characterize the tick reservoir host and pathogen communities over a 2-year period following a large 2015 wildfire, and ticks were collected from rodents before and after a wildfire site, as well as from a nearby unburned site. All ticks were either the Ixodes or Dermacenter genus, and interestingly, this study found a large increase in the proportion of Dermacenter ticks post-fire at both the burned and unburned sites. So the gray bar represents the burned site and the black bar represents the unburned site. And this was pre-fire and post-fire. And you can see both increase significantly post-fire. And sorry, let me just move this. But at the unburned site, the expansion was really even more significant than at the burned site. The same authors in the same study, they also found an increase in the number of animals infested with ticks post-fire at both sites, with a longer duration of infestation at the unburned site. The number of trapped small animal species more than tripled from pre to post-fire at the unburned site, while near doubling from pre to post-fire at the unburned site. These findings suggest that wildland fires alter host and vector habitats in such a way that the species flourish post-fire, thereby increasing abundance of the host reservoir. The last kind of group that the last, I guess, mode of transmission I want to talk about is human-to-human transmission of infectious diseases. So far, we've seen that climate change and extreme weather events are changing the geographic distribution of pathogens, vectors, and reservoir hosts, but they're also having extreme effects on human population movement. In 2019, 33.4 million people were displaced around the world, and 23.9 million of them were displaced due to weather-related events. While weather events such as floods, hurricanes, and fires are often associated with temporary movement, as the events continue to increase in frequency, longer lasting environmental change due to these events, as well as from droughts and famines, may necessitate permanent relocation for vulnerable communities. In North America, for example, droughts and famines related to climate change and extreme weather events such as El Nino have been associated with increasing northward migration from Central America and Guatemala in particular. Existing literature has suggested that extremes in temperature and frequency of natural disasters may be associated with food insecurity and changes in infectious disease epidemiology, but displacement in the setting of an extreme weather event and subsequent infectious disease outcomes is not well understood at all. Overcrowding in shelters or camps like this following Hurricane Katrina may be associated with subsequent communicable disease outbreaks. For example, following Hurricane Katrina in 2005, 27,000 people were evacuated from Louisiana to the single shelter in Houston, Texas. Within 2 weeks after the evacuation, over 1,000 people presented to the shelter clinic with symptoms of gastroenteritis, which is like stomach and intestinal symptoms, usually kind of cramping and diarrhea. Additionally, from about half of these people, a virus called norovirus was identified. Norovirus is a highly transmissible virus in diarrhea transmissible by stool and contaminated water that often causes outbreaks on cruise ships or sometimes like daycare centers or other places where there's a bunch of people crowded together and not the best hygiene. Public health investigators hypothesize that overcrowding and lack of adequate hygiene and sanitation facilities probably exacerbated the spread of infection. And then, apart from overcrowding, delayed or misdiagnoses due to changing infectious disease epidemiology, missed routine childhood vaccinations in the setting of unexpected displacement, and increasing population exposure at the human-animal interface represent other potential routes of communicable disease transmission in the setting of extreme weather events and climate change. There was one study of gonorrhea infection among high school students in New Orleans before and after Hurricane Katrina that found a doubling of the infection rate before and after the hurricane. And then similarly, when Hurricane Sandy struck the East Coast of the United States in 2012, it also resulted in a decrease in HIV screening in up to 25% in certain areas. So this is estimated to probably have caused thousands of missed testing opportunities within that time period. And then the last thing is extreme weather events and COVID-19. So there have been two major effects of extreme weather events on COVID-19. The first one was the February 2021 Texas snowstorm that resulted in a delay of over 1 million vaccines around the country and over 700,000 to Texas alone. And then more recently, there was a study out of Reno, Nevada, which found a 6.3% relative increase in the number of positive COVID tests, corresponding to an estimated 17.7% increase in cases during the 2 months most affected by wildfire smoke from August to October 2020. And then there's this kind of suspected possible link between climate change and antimicrobial resistance. So in the United States, there was a study of the three of the most common human bacterial pathogens: E. coli, Klebsiella pneumoniae, and Staph aureus. E. coli and Klebsiella are common. They're common bacteria that live in the human gastrointestinal tract, and Staph aureus is common kind of in the nose and in the groin, and then kind of depending on the person could also just be common on the skin. But these pathogens, these bacteria that are normally just kind of like live with us and are fine, they can also often cause infections such as UTIs or skin infections. And these authors found a significant association between antibiotic resistance patterns and increasing local temperatures. They couldn't prove causality, or they couldn't even infer causality, but warmer temperatures are known to increase bacterial growth and horizontal gene transfer. And these are two factors that at least make the contribution of climate change to antibiotic resistance plausible. And then one thing that I try to focus on and hopefully can make a little bit of impact is the healthcare sector's contribution to climate change. So while we're responsible for treating all of these patients that are whose health is impacted by climate change, we're also responsible for contributing 5% of the global greenhouse gas emissions and 10% of domestic greenhouse gas emissions. Despite this, there's very little research into the healthcare sector's contribution to climate change. And you can see the publications on climate change in the different sectors are significantly greater with regard to other sectors than they are to health. So that's my last slide. If anyone has any questions, I'll be happy to try my best to answer them.
Thank you so much, Naomi. If everybody wants to share their questions into the Q&A chat, that would be wonderful. There is a comment on one of your slides, which was interesting. But we will take your questions now. One question we did have before the seminar started was more about what diseases are increasing with heat and smoke from fires. You mentioned that, but what about dryness? Are there other diseases that increase with dryness throughout the regions?
Not so much, I wouldn't say dryness alone, but dryness contributes to kind of the aerosolization of pathogens. So that's kind of how that works. And then of course, like the dry environment is also going to contribute to increasing wildfires, which is going to mobilize pathogens in smoke. I'm going to let somebody else answer the Ted Cruz question.
Yep, that sounds like a good idea there. That's great. So everybody's welcome to submit other questions in the Q&A or in the chat there. One question I was wondering with this slide up, actually, do you have any ideas on how the while healthcare industry doesn't contribute as much as other sectors, do you have any ideas on how they could contribute less to climate change, or ways that the greenhouse gas emissions can be reduced?
Yeah, so we're kind of working on some of that here. One of the ways that we're doing that is trying to get more reusable products, like in the operating rooms and around the hospital, as opposed to like one-time disposable products. Another thing that we're doing, which UC Davis is actually really good at, is more sustainable food on our hospital menu. I don't know if they actually do like a eat low on the food chain day or something like that, but anything like that can help. And then something that I've been working on is just kind of the unnecessary waste that the hospital produces through our diagnostics. So healthcare has kind of moved in this direction where instead of like asking questions and then directing your diagnostics at the answers to the questions, somebody kind of walks in and you just do everything all at one time. And that produces a lot of unnecessary waste. So what we're trying to do is kind of go back to this like more strict algorithm of, if the patient answers a question this way, investigate in that direction instead of just doing this shotgun approach. Because I think
Right.
there's a lot of waste produced by like our microbiology lab that people don't even realize. So every time you get like a culture on a patient, it's got to be like collected in a plastic cup and put in a plastic bag and then subcultured onto plastic petri dishes. And then if it doesn't work out, you do more plastic petri dishes. And at the end of the day, you produce like tons of waste that really never had to happen. So we're
Right.
working on that too.
Great. Thank you. A couple questions did come in. One from Katie Conlon. As the ID expert, what do you consider the most concerning emerging infectious disease related to climate change?
The most concerning, so I think there are a couple, some of the ones I talked about were valley fever, so coccidioidomycosis, which is common in like the southern central valley, but it's definitely moving north. And we're starting to see it like in this area. And then as like the smoke and wildfires increase, I wouldn't be surprised if we see that in other areas too. Like if you guys remember they were finding, I think New York and some of the rest of the Northeast were having poor air quality because of the wildfires in Oregon this year. Oregon doesn't have coccidioidomycosis, but it definitely could as things move the way they are. Other things are going to be like these vector related diseases. So I only talked about ticks because that's the most common thing we have right now. Lyme disease is going to spread, but there are other tick-borne diseases that we don't really see yet, but we'll start to see for sure. And people just won't know how to diagnose them. And then there are also mosquito-borne diseases, which I just didn't talk about because we don't have a lot of them in the US, but like as the temperature gets warmer, I wouldn't be surprised if we start seeing more like Zika virus and more dengue virus up here. We'll see West Nile spreading, which we already see here once in a while. So I think a lot of vector-borne diseases for sure. Oh, and then of course, sorry, there's so many. I don't even know where to start, but of course, Vibrio infection, because like the Vibrio one really scares me as the water temperature warms. Like it just becomes so much more tolerant to the different, the different other factors that normally kept it at bay. But like if it's got like a really comfortable temperature, it's not going to care about salinity, and we're going to start seeing it all over the place.
Gotcha. Okay, great. We had a question come in from Leslie Curian. Any insights into diseases related to melting permafrost and ice?
Sorry, that is a good question, but I don't know a lot about that. I think, no, that's not something I've been following, but I have been thinking I should. I think there are some kind of like frozen potential pathogens that have been able to like be cultured from permafrost, but and they're going to kind of be released as it melts, but I don't know of any of them becoming potential problems yet.
It's a scary thought though.
Yeah.
We had one from Holly Oldroyd. You mentioned that there are some microbial measurements associated with controlled burns. Is there any temperature related tolerances for microbes since wildfires are typically a lot hotter than controlled burns?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So that some of those same groups have done studies looking at like how hot and for how long different microbes have to be burning before they're not viable anymore. And generally, of course, like the hotter it is, the less time they need to be burning. And I think it's something like when you get a fire to about 800 degrees Fahrenheit, there's not a whole lot of viable DNA containing cells that you're going to find in the smoke. But most fires don't get to 800 degrees. And then The other thing is that temperature is just the fire temperature. So that there's also going to be all of these microbes that are kind of under the surface that are protected by the dirt on top that aren't going to reach those hot temperatures. And then they're kind of going to be stirred up in the smoke and aerosolized. But yeah, that's a really good question. I think generally if it only gets to like a few hundred degrees, there's not a whole lot of effect um, on the viable microbes. But once you get up to kind of like 700, 800 degrees, it has a much greater effect on them.
Okay. Okay. We have another one from Tamara Kadir. Is there any concern about novel zoonotic diseases that can more readily jump from animals to humans, as factors like habitat loss pushes animals and humans into closer proximity to each other?
Yeah, so that's kind of, well, that's going to be related to the vector-borne diseases. So all of the tick-borne diseases are going to bring people and ticks into closer contact, and they're also going to bring us into closer contact with the reservoirs, like the mice. There are other zoonotic diseases. They're pretty rare in the United States, but we do occasionally see things like the plague here. We see tularemia. These are all zoonotic infections. Well, they're really vector-borne infections, but they usually come from like rodents or other kind of small animals, and we're definitely going to see more of those, I think. I mean, I hope not, but they're not very treatable, so I'm nervous about that. And then in other countries, we're definitely seeing them. So I think like we have COVID going on right now, but there are much deadlier infections that have the potential to spread also, such as like Nipah virus is one that, as it's prevalent in like South Asia and has a fatality rate of, usually I think it's like anywhere from 50 to 95%. And it comes from bats, just like coronaviruses. And as people kind of encroach onto animal habitats, there's definitely more of those outbreaks going on.
Great, thank you. And that is we're at about time for this webinar. So once again, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. And thank you so much, Dr. Hauser, for giving this wonderful presentation and answering everybody's questions. I'm sure if you have additional questions, you can shoot Naomi an email and she would be glad to discuss with you after the webinar. We'd also like to invite you to participate in future webinars. You can look at our website here to see what additional webinars are coming up. But otherwise, we hope that you have a great rest of your day, and we will email you a recording of this webinar once it's done. Thank you again, Dr. Hauser, and thank you everybody for joining us today.
Thank you.